You're listening to the Sustainable Angler Podcast. I'm your host, Rick Crawford. In this episode, I interviewed Charleston Waterkeeper Executive Director Andrew Wunderley, and we talk about everything from how Charleston Waterkeeper is fighting to keep our water clean, how plastic pollution is Charleston's dirty little secret, the impact climate change is having on Charleston's water quality, and how nature has already engineered the perfect climate solutions. Hope you enjoy. This episode of The Sustainable Angler is brought to you by Emerger Strategies. Climate change is the single greatest threat to fish on the planet. That's why we're on a mission to solve the climate crisis by helping your business go carbon neutral and zero waste. To learn more, visit emergerstrategies.com. I'll kind of provide, a little bit of background for everyone listening in terms of Charleston Waterkeeper and how Andrew and I met was through, and I'll have to just go ahead and kick things off with a tip of the hat to Charleston Waterkeeper. I moved to Charleston 7 years ago. And when I first moved here, I was looking for a way to get involved in the community and support conservation work. And I started volunteering for Charleston Waterkeeper, and it was such a valuable, mutually beneficial thing just as a volunteer, because I was able to do good conservation work through Charleston Waterkeeper volunteering, but then also made a lot of friends and contacts along the way, and including Andrew. So if you're moving to Charleston, you should look to get involved with Charleston Waterkeeper. But that was just my experience. So I wanted to really get things kicked off, though, with just getting a little bit of your background, Andrew. I know that you've been with Charleston Waterkeeper since its inception, I believe, and just kind of wanted to get things kicked off with a little bit of background on yourself and Waterkeeper.
Yeah. Well, and thanks for kicking off with the volunteer corps. We're real proud of that. It's just a great program, and highly encourage folks to get involved. Especially folks moving to town, a lot of folks don't have that kind of experience, like in the salt marsh, in the mud, in the creeks, on the oyster beds. And so, we're kind of the gateway to a lot of that for folks, which is really interesting, because I think, once you get out there and you experience those types of habitats and those type of, marine and estuarine environments firsthand, you can't help but fall in love. It is more than just a pretty view out there, right? Getting folks out there, getting them muddy, getting them wet, maybe even a little cut up and bruised and sore, I think is always a good thing for conservation. So, the more you get your hands on, and it makes such a big difference for folks. But yeah, I started with Charleston Waterkeeper back in 2011, and I was actually, I think technically the second employee. It was really, really startup at that point. Had just gotten a board of directors together, had just kind of gotten a sense of itself, and had a founding executive director and Waterkeeper. And I came on in 2011 to sort of build some structure and put some meat behind the program and the advocacy work. How are we going to be Charleston's voice for clean water, right? And we set about doing that work, and built out a water quality monitoring program, built out a volunteer program, and really started looking at what issues were important, both in terms of the overall health of our estuary here, but also what issues were important to the folks that were using them. The fishermen, the surfers, the paddlers. Believe it or not, there's a big open water swimming community here, right? Even recreational boaters and beach goers and photographers. I mean, there's everybody's got these really great, interesting, and very, very personal connections to the water. And so, in 2015, our founding director, Waterkeeper, moved on, and then I took the reins at that point as director and Waterkeeper. And it's been on since then. It's just been really, I mean, it just seems like, everything kind of started firing all cylinders, and we were able to really, really just, get out there and be super active and make some good things happen for clean water. I think, my personal connection, I come to this work as a surfer and a swimmer. And, I've always had that sort of personal connection through what I love to do, which, I think, you hear this a lot, you protect what you love. And, the thought of it being too polluted to surf, or it being too polluted to host any of these open water swims that we have here in town, or it being too polluted to fish, like it's just unbearable. It's something we can't sit idly by and just accept, right? That's, the march of progress is going to leave us with waterways that are unhealthy for the things that we love to do. And that's why we exist. That's why we fight for clean water every day.
Yep. Well, that's awesome. And I'll also say that we touched on this a little bit before we started recording, but I'll just say too, with the volunteer corps, and just in general with Charleston Waterkeeper, I was telling Andrea that it's amazing how much work that they get done. I mean, they're at sponsoring events and happy hours and always talking and promoting clean water. And as a Charleston resident, not just as a Charleston Waterkeeper member and volunteer, but as just a resident who gets to benefit from the work of Charleston Waterkeeper, which is, I don't know how many tons of plastic y'all have pulled out of the marsh and the citizen science that goes behind what y'all do. But it's really impressive, and it's relentless in the best way possible. So thank y'all for all the work that you have and continue to do.
Yeah, thanks. This is where we need to pause and give a huge shout out to Cheryl Carmack, who organizes all those volunteer events.
Absolutely.
And coordinates the volunteers. And I mean, talk about like making it happen, right? Volunteer events especially just don't happen. There's a lot that goes behind the scenes to make sure everything from like, where's the trash going after the cleanup to, where you park in to waivers. I mean, it gets mind boggling really quick. And, we hustle hard at that stuff because folks really like it. To see folks after spending 2 hours, like slinging oyster shells or, pulling big, and, the amount of plastic out there, we could get into that more too in a little bit, but, the amount of plastic that's out there in our marshes is just staggering. And, you can't come and do a cleanup with us and walk away and say, no, we don't have a problem with plastic pollution. Right? If we didn't have any salt marsh here and it were just sandy shoreline or rocky shoreline, it would be such a visceral issue, right? Yep. People be screaming from the top of their lungs, like, what's going on here? There'd be plastic strewn all up and down the shoreline of the harbor. You just can't see it. It's like our dirty secret, right? It looks beautiful, but when you get down there and close and look at it, and the easiest thing for folks to do, and I'm already starting to get onto the plastic pollution thing just because it's such a hot and important issue. But if you don't believe me, don't take my word for it. You go down to Waterfront Park next time you're downtown, walk up to the railing and just look over into the marsh there. And we just did a cleanup there this weekend and, pulled out, I don't know, a ton of plastic, considering how light that plastic material is. I mean, it's staggering. But there's always so many different ways to get involved, whether it's, we're, hopefully at the tail end of this pandemic right now, but, when we're firing on all cylinders, there's monthly happy hours, there's, 2, 3, 4 volunteer events a month. Sometimes there's events like Seaweed and the Charleston Farmers Market. And there's just, tons of way to get involved in all this activity. I mean, we call it the fight for clean water, but there's so many different components of it. If folks, go to the charlestonwaterkeeper.org/volunteer, there's, usually a huge list of events there that you can kind of just get involved in. And it's really neat to see people come and do it. And they start coming a few times. You see them a little bit more, And, that's when, the light bulb's gone off. And I mean, that's what we need. We need a community of stewards here, to protect this, protect the special place that we call home here in Charleston. It isn't gonna stay healthy, or it's not going to get healthier, and we're not going to be able to clean it up and restore it without people being actively engaged in that work. We can't just set things aside and say, oh yeah, this is, we've conserved this over here. I mean, we have to be active participants in it,
Yeah. And that's one of the things, I'm pretty sure it's an Yvonne Chouinard quote, but it's the answer for depression is action. And and
that's a good one.
Yeah. Right. And to me, that just like nails what I think that's probably why y'all are so successful here, is that first off, once you're sort of your eyes are open to how insane the amount of plastic pollution there is in everywhere really, but specific to Charleston, then you realize, all right, well, I want to do something about it, and y'all provide the vehicle to get out and do it.
I'm glad you hit on that. It's a great quote, but that idea of like, that idea of being active, right? And one of the things I think that's really rewarding for me is this, tiny little sliver of a role that we play, sort of in the process of democracy in a way, right? Like people come out and have an experience with us, and they're like, "Wow, we've got a big problem with plastic pollution," right? Well, on the other flip side of that, we're not just out there showing people what the problem is and, trying to restore these marshes and clean them up, right? On the flip side of that, we're working behind the scenes to develop good policy, in state and local government, right? That's going to protect that, ensure it doesn't get worse, and, try to make it better, right? So, not only are we out there like getting dirty, but we're, in city councils, we're in the General Assembly in Columbia, having those conversations, trying to develop the good policy. And a lot of times that stuff just happens behind the scenes and nobody thinks about it. But there's always these really cool opportunities to connect people with that process, whether it be, sending a letter to your state representative or your state senator, or, showing up at a town of Mount Pleasant council meeting and using the public comment period to talk about, what these issues mean to you. And, when I walk into the room, I'm a crazy conservationist, tree hugger, type. I've got an agenda, right? My agenda is clean water. Everybody knows that, right? But when ordinary, citizens, right, come, they spend their time to do it. They show up at a council meeting, they call their senator. They, we've even had a few drive to Columbia, right, to testify, in Columbia on different issues. And, you ought to see your elected, they sit up straighter, they listen closer, they really, holding them to account for the responsibility that they have to represent you and the issues that are important to you, especially on conservation and clean water issues, I think is so critically important. And I love being that little conduit for making that happen. And, people always ask too, they're like, well, what should I say? Or, I don't want to say anything wrong, or, do you have talking points? And, really, I mean, sometimes we do that, like here's some good talking points to hit, but a lot of times it's encouraging folks to speak with their own voice and find their own voice. Those are the messages that really resonate, right? Not the canned, coordinated response that came from a conservation organization or environmental nonprofit. I mean, that's important, right? That's important. But I think what really is important is when people speak from their own experience. I fish there, right? the marsh isn't the same as it always is. And, we're filling it full of trash, or, the marsh is dying back, or whatever it is. And so, when you speak from that personal place, you get, the message resonates a lot stronger with your elected officials. And I think they listen a lot closer. And I think they take those stories to heart. I know they do. I've heard that directly from them. So, playing that little pipeline, I think is just, I love that. I think it's neat to see folks stand up and speak on behalf of their waterways and why they're important to them. I love that. And it's always really rewarding. And so, I wish we could do that all day, every day. But we try to maximize those opportunities for folks. It's another way, like just, it seems sort of silly, but just getting on Charleston Waterkeeper's mailing list, our email list, can connect you with those types of opportunities when they come up.
Yeah. And I mean, I literally am an example of getting plugged into the Waterkeeper network with volunteering. I can't drive that home enough for me personally, and for anyone out there that's like, maybe you're feeling overwhelmed, or you're having, anxiety about what's happening to the environment. Like it's a very rewarding feeling to get out and look at the progress that you made in a morning or an afternoon to clean up an area. But that's also something. So a couple of things I want to talk about with your volunteer program. One, there's always like trash cleanups, and those are like everywhere. But also there's volunteer events for rebuilding oyster reefs and shells. I was wondering if you could touch on a little bit of that, because the reason I bring that up is for since we are on the sustainable angler, is that there's so many benefits to, so you take plastic out in a cleanup, but with a oyster restoration project, you're helping to really enhance the fishery. And so there may be people listening who maybe never heard of this, but if you could just shed a little light on that, I thought that would be cool.
Yeah, the lowly little oyster, right? Not only did they taste great, but they do all this other wonderful stuff. We can look at this whole issue of clean water through the lens of the oyster, period, which would be maybe the subject of a whole nother episode. But and huge shout out to South Carolina Department of Natural Resources here. They have the SCORE program, the South Carolina Oyster Recycling and Enhancement Program. And so they, state funded program that does a lot of different things, right? One is, they collect shell from restaurants. The other thing they do is they buy shell. So another kind of dirty secret about Charleston is a lot of our shell that comes out of local waterways doesn't go back in, right? It'll end up in a landfill, or it end up in somebody's driveway or something like that. So we actually have to buy shell to restore. We have to buy shell from the Gulf or other places to restore South Carolina oyster beds, which is just insane to me. I mean, I think you almost have to have a deposit on your oyster shell, make sure it goes back in. That's another story too. But, the DNR, purchases, or recycles the shell stock. And then, they're a smaller part of DNR and got a really great crew, a super dedicated staff to that program. What they were lacking, or what they always need, is big groups of volunteers. And so it was just kind of a natural partnership between Charleston Waterkeeper and our ability to mobilize big groups of volunteers and the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources SCORE program. So we do a lot of different activities for that crew. We do what's called a oyster recycling event, or a trash picking event, where after the shell's been, after you've, had your oyster roast or whatever, and you drop off at a DNR drop-off site, that shell goes to a facility where it's quarantined, right? So, all the bacteria and everything else can die off. And it sits there in big piles and just bakes in the sun, right? Very complicated process. You just want to keep it dry and let the sun and the dryness do its thing. But there's this thing, like, if you've ever been to an oyster roast, that barrel in the middle of the table, like everything goes in there, right? Yep. Not just the shell. And so, it's beer cans, it's oyster knives, towels, it's, cracker sleeves, it's, little plastic ramekins and silverware and, that sort of stuff. And it all ends up in that oyster bin. If there could be one takeaway from this, it's like, don't throw your trash in the oyster barrel, right? That should be clean shell only, or, use shell only. But I was, thinking about doing a little campaign about like roast like a pro or something. I don't know.
I support
roast
that.
like a pro.
Yeah.
Roast like a local. I don't know.
Yeah.
So, all that shell goes then to be quarantined, and we work with DNR. We put groups of volunteers out there with trash pickers, and they pick all that plastic and debris out of the shell so that all that debris doesn't then go in the water with the new shell when you replant an oyster bed. So after the shell's been quarantined, it goes over to the Fort Johnson DNR site on James Island, and it'll get dropped off there in a big pile. And then DNR has this really great method for putting the shell into bags, right? And so we'll bring a group of volunteers. I mean, we've had some huge groups over there, 100, 110, 120 people. Everybody's got shovels and bags, and you fill up these bags with oyster shell, and then you stack them on pallets. And man, you go home from that, you don't need to go to the gym. You're ready for a beer at about noon. It's just, it's a really physically demanding thing, but it's fun and really rewarding.
Yeah.
You get a big group of people and the pile goes down, and, we've been able to finish the pile a few times, which is always really exciting. So that shell then gets, during the oyster harvesting season, we're working on bagging with DNR. And so, there'd be a bunch of pallets lined up and stored up. And then in the summer months, when the oysters are reproducing during the oyster reproduction, in the summer, and when there's no harvesting going on because water temperatures are too warm, we're working with DNR to take that bagged shell and then build new oyster reef with it, out in creeks, out in marshes. And, that's always a lot of fun too, because it involves boats, it involves oyster shells, usually involves a tidal creek or a river or something. And, you start putting like a lot of your favorite things together in one place. And basically you form a big sort of daisy chain bucket brigade and hand the bags. And then you've got a couple DNR staffers who sort of construct the reef. And so again, we're providing the physical labor and the muscle, and DNR's got the knowledge and the know-how and the experience. It's been a lot of really great partnership. I can't speak highly enough of the folks in that program. I think it's one of my favorite things that DNR does. Obviously, I'm a little biased, but so really, you could come help clean up the shell. You could bag the shell, and then you could put the shell in the water. Yeah. Right. And you're seeing that full. Well, actually, let's start there. Let's make a full circle out of that, because you could eat the oyster, right? Right. You could clean its shell, then you could bag its shell, and then you could put it back in the water to grow new oysters, where you can then harvest them and eat them again. Right. It's 100% renewable resource, and that's why I think I think it's really important that we make sure that all the shell that comes out of South Carolina waters goes back into South Carolina water. I mean, the idea that we have to use, shell from Mississippi or from Florida or from wherever drives me nuts, right? Yeah, I mean, why should we have Virginia oyster shells here? We should have South Carolina shells here.
Which, by the way, if you have never had a Lowcountry oyster, you are missing out on the greatest oyster on the planet. We have what are
best
called
tasting, for sure.
Yeah, what are called blades, and they're in clusters, so they're not your famous singles that you get in New Orleans or wherever on the half shell. These are clusters, and they are salty and they are delicious as is.
Yeah, they're perfect, and they have just the right amount of salt. I mean,
yeah. So maybe
like home.
Maybe I'll have to edit that out. We don't want anyone coming in for our oysters, but all right, cool. Well, so we. Did you have anything else you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I just, again, like that whole crew at DNR really enables that work to happen. And it's just been a nice marriage of like volunteer muscle and DNR know-how.
Well, one of the things that I wanted to hopefully kind of get an update on, just because there may be, a lot of people listening who, because of quarantine and everything else, maybe haven't been as involved, is what are, like, I've read a little about it, but I'll if you could provide an update on sort of what's some of the latest whether it's water quality, which by the way, we haven't necessarily touched on as much. Y'all do a lot with water quality monitoring, but what are some of the environmental threats that Charleston Waterkeeper helps with, and what's sort of the latest on that front?
Well, yeah, so we have two different water quality testing programs. One we call the swim team, where we test bacteria levels every Wednesday, May through the end of October, and we're capturing the recreational season when folks are out swimming and paddling and that sort of thing. And the idea there is like, is it safe to go swimming? Can I take my kids swimming? And, do I need to be worried about getting sick? And so we sample for a species of indicator bacteria called Enterococcus that's just, highly associated with the intestines of warm-blooded animals, dogs, cats, birds, you, me, right? Pretty much sums up all the different sources of bacteria. And, we see, roughly 30 to 35% of our samples fail every year, right? So really important that folks pay attention to that data if they want to know when and where it's safe to go swimming. The other thing that we do on water quality testing wise is what we call the creek watchers. And so we have a network of about 12, 13 volunteer creek watchers, and they adopt a site and they go out and test it every month. And so we're after temperature, salinity, dissolved oxygen, turbidity, pH, and then they also do dolphin surveys. They do surveys for invasive algae species. They do. They actually do pellet like nurdle counts, and we can talk about the nurdles in a minute. But so they're serving as our eyes and ears, right? They're out there kind of, and the idea with those water quality parameters is to they're like the vital signs. You go to a doctor, they take your blood pressure and your pulse rate, right? Similar things. If dissolved oxygen is out of whack or if turbidity is really high, like you can start to draw certain conclusions about what may or may not be happening in particular waterways. But it's just a good way for us. And, the other thing too, is they've become sort of de facto Charleston Waterkeeper ambassadors. They roll up with a little water quality testing bucket, start doing all this sampling work, and folks are like, well, hey, what are you doing? What's going on here? Is it okay? Like what does the data show you? And they become ambassadors for us, which has been really cool.
Yeah.
I didn't expect that to happen at first. Yeah. And, again, like it's one thing to hear it from us, but it's another thing to hear it from a volunteer who's doing it, because they love the work, and they love doing the sampling and they love being out, near the creek or whatever, near the river, wherever they are. So, highly encourage folks to pay attention to that. I mean, it's really good citizen science about what the state of your waterways are, right? Mm-hmm. And there really isn't, we were surprised to learn years ago that, there really wasn't a lot of water quality testing going on, right? There might only be a handful of sites that gets tested by DHEC every year. DNR is pretty good about testing oyster beds because those beds have to be open for either recreational or commercial shellfishing. And so that's jobs, right? Jobs and money on the line. And so there's a little bit more resources to go into the shellfish safety testing. But in terms of just ambient water quality monitoring, like what are the conditions if I want to go swimming? Nobody could answer that question before we started doing that work. So, we found some areas like James Island Creek and Shem Creek that have really high levels of bacteria. And we started then advocating for communities to step up and take responsibility for cleaning those up. And you see a lot of good work going on in Shem Creek right now, but also there's been a task force, an intergovernmental task force formed on around James Island Creek, city, county, town, that are going to be responsible for identifying and implementing projects that will limit the amount of bacteria that's being discharged into James Island Creek. So it's going to be slow, grinding work, but we're in it for the long haul. And hopefully, when I pass this work off to somebody else, we can start talking about what a success story James Island Creek is in terms of getting it cleaned up and making it safe for swimming. So those types of direct water quality issues are always hot, right? The one that sprung up here in 2019 and 2020 is these little plastic nurdles. I don't know if you've seen any of that in the paper, but Rick, it's funny that, we were looking at this plastic pollution problem. Like, I mean, what do you see in the marsh, right? You see bottles, bags, styrofoam, like that kind of, it's a consumer single use stuff. It gets used once, blows out of the back of the boat, out of a pickup truck, whatever, and that's one set of problems, one set of solutions, and communities all around the harbor have stepped up and, enacted these single use plastic pollution bans. And, the aquariums keep some really good data about the different types and amounts of debris that comes out of our waterways and what's ending up in the turtles and things like that. And you can bet if it's in turtles, it's also in birds and it's also in fish. And so, we were feeling pretty good and, about some of the progress that the Charleston communities all around the harbor have made on that issue. And then, let me think. It was the summer of 2000. It was July in 2019. We got a call from one of our supporters who walks his dogs on the beach at Sullivan's every morning, and he's like, "Hey, there are these tiny little plastic beads all over the place here, and like, who, this isn't right. And, who should I report it to?" And so we helped him get it reported, and then went out there to check it out and collected a bunch of samples, and really quickly learned way more than I ever thought I would about nurdles and plastic production. And they're actually called pellets. Nobody really knows where this name nurdle came from, but so when you mix the chemicals together to make plastic, they form it into these nurdles, and they're about the size of a like a lentil or something like that, right? And they get manufactured down in the Gulf Mexico area, and then they get brought up here by train. And then at a facility, the name of the company is called Frontier Logistics, but at that facility that operates at Union Pier downtown, they take them out of those train cars, use a pneumatic machine that kind of sucks them out of the train car, and then they put them into bags. And then they sew the bags shut. Those bags get stacked onto pallets. Those pallets go into containers, and then those containers go all over the world. And so if you're making, I don't know, like a Bic pen or an iPhone case or anything made out of plastic, chances are it started as a pellet, as a nurdle.
Okay.
And so they're sort of the raw material that you make, that you mold things out of, plastic things. And so that, what we started to do was take samples, right? We developed, with the help of a researcher at the University of Texas at Austin, developed a 10-minute sampling protocol that we could really quickly and easily deploy. And basically, you go out, you find the high tide, the most recent, high tide line, and you get down on your hands and knees, and you use your fingertips to sift through the sand or the rack or the grass or whatever. And you pick up as many pellets as you can find in 10 minutes, right? And so on average, we find 50 to 60 in 10 minutes, just about every time we look, everywhere. Rick, we got to go out and do this sometime. It'll blow your mind, like how many of these things are out there. And once you start looking, you can't unsee the problem. Like if I go for a walk on a beach or something, I can't help myself. Like I've got to look, and it's really torturous because, once you see these things, you can't unsee them. Yeah. So long story short is when we did, we've got like 14, 15, oh man, I can't remember. It's probably 15 months of sampling now. And the closer you get to the Frontier facility at Union Pier, the higher the densities you get per 10 minutes. And so despite all that evidence, DHEC has never lodged an enforcement action or any kind of fines or penalties against this company. And that's just not right. It can't be, obviously we welcome business into our community. There's no question about that, right? Sure. But businesses that can't operate without spilling plastic into the harbor, that's just not acceptable, right? It's not acceptable to come here, spill, and then say, hey, it's not ours. That's been the answer so far. It's not ours. We don't know where it came from, right? Oh. And
that's nice.
It's right. And, the answer was, it's not ours and you can't prove it is, right? And so, we were like, well, yeah, we can, right? We have this, these densities get higher and higher, and they're the highest on either side of the facility. Like if on average we're, 50, 50 to 60. When we get, close to the facility, we're like 120, right, per 10 minutes. They're all along the fence line of the facility. If you go sit, so wind, rain, floods, all that, washes this stuff right into the harbor, where then it just sort of disperses out. And, after it's been spilled, I mean, what's going on here is this, they're just operating, the whole business of transporting and bagging these things is built on volume, speed. And so, if a pallet spills over and these things go all over the ground, nobody stops to clean them up. If the pneumatic machines break down and the nurdles spill all over the, warehouse floor, at one point they were using blowers to, and not cleaning up. Right. And so these things were just, escaping and, washing into the water during rain, flood storms and stuff like that. And so, we, as the last resort in this case, DHEC wouldn't act, there was no enforcement action. We used what's called the citizen suit provision of the Federal Clean Water Act to file, and the citizen suit provision under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, two big pieces of federal legislation that lay out the framework to protect local waterways. We used those citizen suits to sue in federal court, to get this company, to get the pollution stopped and to hold them accountable for the pollution that's already out there. Yeah. But once these things escaped, I mean, it's, damn near impossible to clean them up, right? Yeah. I mean, they're tiny and they're so dispersed. And so, those cases right now, we feel confident we've got a lot of good data and evidence that, points to this company as the culprit. Those cases right now are working their way through federal court downtown in Charleston. And, it's really, I mean, it's, this only case of its kind in the country. There's been one other case that dealt with a manufacturer of these pellets, that the manufacturer itself was discharging these things into the San Antonio Bay. And here, we're dealing with a transporter, right? Which is a little bit different of an issue. But, those two, our case and the case in Texas are the only two that I know about nationally on this issue. And the one in Texas, they won a $50 million judgment against its largest settlement in Clean Water Act history for the kind of blatant and disregard and discharging these things into the, San Antonio Bay. So remains to be seen, 2021 is going to reveal a lot on that issue, I think, coming forward. So a lot going on with that one.
Yeah. Well, no, it makes you think, I mean, if there's only two cases, because I've seen pictures, I've been following the story through y'all's social media and the Post and Courier, and these, I mean, they're about the size of like a fish egg, and they're the ones that I saw were like clear. Mm-hmm. And I was like, how would you know if you weren't specifically, dialed into like, this is what I'm looking for? I'm sure that they're everywhere along the transport of from where they're manufactured to where they're put on a ship. And that's just a half of it.
Right. And, you only know what you're looking for, and you don't know to look until, somebody reports something to you, somebody gives you a tip, or you notice it yourself. And so, it's a couple of things there. Is one, we rely on citizens a lot to tip us off to issues. And so, we're always kind of feeling those calls and emails, but, you mentioned that they look like fish eggs, and they look, especially when they're floating in the water, when they're strewn, kind of across the rack line at the high tide, they're all kind of mixed in with little dead pieces of spartina and other organic debris. They stand out to fish and to birds as food sources, right? Fish and birds are, call them sort of, opportunistic feeders, right? They, something stands out in the environment and it reads to them as a food source, right? You think about the way fish feed a lot of times, or the way birds feed, and you can see what a problem these things can become really quickly. They can get mistaken for food. And the other thing too is the science shows that plastic in the marine environment actually becomes more and more toxic over time, which is a terrible thought, right? So not only do you have this problem with impaction, right? Like birds and fish getting sort of impacted with plastic debris, but you also have this issue of the plastic that they're taking in is soaking up other pollutants in the water. and actually becoming more and more toxic, which can be a big problem. Like if you care at all about wildlife or fishing, I mean, the plastic pollution is just a terrible scourge right now. And the aquarium, they've got some really striking data about what comes in turtles, which is when they bring them into the hospital, they will actually pull all the plastic debris out of their stomachs.
Oh God.
Oh, it's awful. I mean, it's awful. And so, the step one is, look, I mean, we need to get this problem stopped, right? Step two is we need to make sure we have the appropriate, policy structure that prevents this kind of thing from happening in the first place. And so State Senator Sandy Sen has been a real leader on that issue and has really advocated pretty strongly. She took a jar of our nurdles that we had collected, just to show people what they are, sort of for demonstration purposes. But she took them up to Columbia and was, at the well. They called the podium there in the Senate the well, and held them up to show people, like, look, these things are all over the place in Charleston. And so it was a real visceral reminder for folks about how big an issue this is. But she's been a fantastic advocate for local waterways on that issue.
Yep. That's awesome. Well, there's one, because I do want to shift gears and talk about some of those solutions and success stories from Charleston Waterkeeper, for example, at the policy level with bans and things like that. But one thing that I was curious about before and I want to make sure we're also covering it, because y'all do so much. I do want to make sure we're covering everything. But we've, with regards to water quality, and the bacteria, just for my own clarification, that bacteria that's related to sewage. Am I understanding that? But also, I guess, stormwater runoff. And
so think about it this way, right? The answer is yes, and yes, and yes. So the sources of bacteria are there's no mystery there, right? So it's some, if you take a creek like James Island Creek that has high levels of bacteria, it's going to be some combination of leaky sewer infrastructure, sewer overflows, high densities of septic tanks, dog waste. Believe it or not, there's a lot of bacteria per ounce of material. Sewer infrastructure, septic tanks, dog waste, and wildlife waste, right? So raccoons, birds, congregate in small areas. Like stormwater ponds with geese can be a big problem.
Oh,
right?
Interesting.
The other can be discharges from vessels that have, discharges from boats with a head system. Usually your head system has a Y valve after the tank, and it can go to a deck fitting where you can pump it out, or it can go overboard right into the water. And so, there's no mystery about what the sources of bacteria are. The relative contributions among those things that's where the dirty details are. And it's almost a bit of a red herring, in my opinion, to chase down exactly what is the biggest contributing source, because I think it changes, right?
Yeah.
It changes based, and you hit on it, the stormwater, right? So stormwater is the pathway for a lot of this stuff to get into the creek, right? So, a septic tank drain field inundates in a flooding event, and then as that water drains away, it goes right into the nearest creek or river. Sewer overflows onto the street during a heavy rainstorm. It goes with the rainwater down the drain and in the pipe right out to the creek. That's an important takeaway, is that our stormwater here in Charleston isn't treated, right? What goes down the drains goes right out into the harbor, right out into James Island Creek, right into the Ashley River. There's no treatment on that, right? Some communities, they have a different way of doing it up north, but in some of the bigger urban cities, they have a little different way of doing it, where they combine stormwater and sewage water in the same set of pipes. That leads to another set of problems. Here, we have one set of pipes for drainage and another set of pipes for sewers, right? For the poop water. And so, it's that stormwater a lot of times is the pathway for the bacteria to end up in the water itself. So, the solutions, can be something as simple as dog waste stations, like, making sure that you can't go more than a block or, a half a mile or a quarter mile or something like that without bumping into one of those things. and encouraging folks to do the right thing, especially in their own backyard. That's a big one. Had a guy tell me one time how concerned he was for standing in his backyard on here in Shem Creek. And he's telling me, I'm just so concerned about all this bacteria. And, I'm looking around and there's dog poop all over the yard. I said, well, step one. He goes, oh, no, that's good for the water. It's good nutrients, right, for the marsh. I just fling it into the marsh when I clean it out. I said, right. Yeah, no joke. And, it's sort of old kind of cultural practices like that, I think, that need to change a little bit. You'd be hard pressed to find somebody that thinks it's okay to leave the dog waste, like on the street or in the public park or something like that. I think most people are pretty good about that piece. Although, you do find it sometimes. Yeah. Well, I mean, maybe more than sometimes. So, that's a big issue. That's the big issue with bacteria is you need a set of solutions that looks at all those, right? Requirements for folks to get their septic tanks pumped out and maintained. You want to make sure that your water and sewer utilities are focusing repair and maintenance work in vulnerable areas around creeks where, they know that overflows are happening. Yep. You want to make sure folks are picking up after their dogs. You want to make sure you have a good lock on your dumpster behind your grocery store, right? So raccoons don't get in there, and, attracting nuisance wildlife or something like that can then lead to, a lot of waste in one place that washes into the creek. It's super sexy work when you're talking about poop and stuff like that.
Well, no, what's interesting is I've done some interviews recently, and we were talking about, particularly in Florida, where they have a lot of these same issues, because the septic tanks were built into a porous,
right.
And so they're like, whoever came up with this, they're like, brilliant decision. They're like, all the sewage is going right into these bays, and so what's interesting is that you find, or at least I learn a lot doing these interviews. And that's one of the things that I love about doing these, is that you find these same issues in coastal areas for different reasons. But at the end of the day, there are solutions.
Right.
We've just got to have the sort of the education and the wherewithal to get them going, which I think is what Waterkeeper is helping us do.
Well, yeah. And, Rick, you hit on something there too, so Waterkeeper, Charleston Waterkeeper, for maybe some of your listeners that aren't in the Charleston area, we're the Waterkeeper for just Charleston. There's tons of Waterkeepers working in Florida, North Carolina, all up and down the East Coast, all through the Gulf, on the West Coast, even internationally. We've got Waterkeepers in Mexico and Central and South America. We've got Waterkeepers in China. We've got a real growing program on the African continent. I mean, there is a global network of folks just like us that are doing this work on a local level in their communities. And so, if you're in Florida, I'd highly encourage you to look up your local Waterkeeper. If you're taking that dream fishing trip somewhere internationally, there's probably a Waterkeeper close by or working, on conservation issues that are important to their waterways and their communities. And so, I think that's one thing that's totally unique and really cool about the Waterkeeper movement and network is, there's these identifiable people, Waterkeepers, speaking for and on behalf of their local communities and local waterways. And just a great way. I mean, we were talking a little bit earlier, about getting active as a way to, kind of counteract the sort of, onslaught of bad news and dire predictions about climate. We haven't even touched climate change.
Oh, well,
right? And what that's doing locally.
I think we're going to have a part two to this interview for that.
The Post and Courier has been doing some excellent reporting on climate change with that Rising Water series, and big kudos to that crew, and Tony Bartolome and Glenn Smith, and so they've been doing just a fantastic. Chloe Johnson's been doing a lot of good reporting on that. It's just been really, really neat to see Post and Courier pick that up. I mean, we could do a whole thing on and we're working through this too. This idea of climate resilient waterways, right? Yeah. I mean, not only we need to protect our local waterways from climate change, right, but we also need to look at them as part of the solution, right? there, I mean, think about, like, we talk about climate change and it's all about like flooding and intense rainstorms. Well, you know what, over eons, billions of years of geologic process, nature designed this really awesome way to deal with flooding. It's called a wetland. Right?
Right.
And if we could just leave the dang things alone, right?
Yeah.
Like, let's just not build on them. Let's just not drain them. Let's just protect them. Right. We would be so far ahead of ourselves where we are right now. And it just, like, that the wetland protections, saltwater wetlands, freshwater wetlands, forested wetlands. Oh my gosh. Like, that's one of the things I think we're going to be moving towards. Waterkeeper is going to be moving more and more into that area here moving forward. But, that idea of solutions and successes and that sort of thing. I mean, it all starts with, folks getting involved and getting engaged, where you can see the impact of your actions, however small, right? Sometimes it might only be a bag of trash on a Saturday, other times, it might be a trip to Columbia to testify, and then, a particular action that your elected leaders take in Columbia that comes out the way you were advocating for. I mean, those
Right.
are really, you mentioned the single-use plastic bans. I mean, that's a big one. And, the effort that's been undertaken, gosh, I mean, this will be the 6th year in a row now, I think. There's this idea of the ban on bans, right? That,
Yeah. Yep.
It's almost laughable, right? Like that, the South Carolina General Assembly, with all that's going on in the state, and all that we need to accomplish, is so concerned about uniformity. And it boggles the mind that, the South Carolina General Assembly is going to tell the town of Mount Pleasant or the city of Charleston what rules they can and can't make about single-use plastic pollution. I mean, it's insane. Columbia needs to focus on other things, not our efforts to limit the amount of trash in our waterways. I mean, it would be nice if we could get some help with that issue rather than having to fend off an effort to stop it. But yeah, great, other communities, the ban on bans just rolls through state legislatures super easy, right? But here we've fought it and stopped it for the last 6 years straight, right? Yep. I mean, that's really remarkable. Really remarkable. I mean, folks should be proud of that. It doesn't happen because of us. It happens because people speak up, and they let their local elected reps. I mean, they let their local elected officials know exactly what they think of those, right? Their state. I mean, that's just really cool. It's really cool. Well, I mean, go ahead.
Well, no, I was just going to say, I mean, I would not have known about this if it wasn't for Charleston Waterkeeper. And so I testified in Charleston and in Columbia when there was a city ban in Charleston, and drove up to Columbia to let them know. And for me, not only just as an angler, but it's, I have children. Like, this is what we're leaving them. This is our legacy. And I have to say, I mean, I guess the best word for it was empowering to voice my opinion and my belief that, hey, we need to be doing something about this. And it was, I would encourage everyone who is concerned or feels this way with an opportunity to let your elected officials know they should take it because it's well worth the time.
I'm glad you used that word empowering. You summed that up really well. And that word empowering, I think, is important because that's what it is. I mean, to be an active participant in this process is empowering. We had a woman a couple of years ago went up, and it was the first time she'd ever done anything like that. And, all the hearings and everything were in the morning. So after it was all over and before driving back, we got lunch in Columbia. And I mean, she was literally buoyant. Like, the excitement and the energy was just like incredible. I mean, and it was to have that sort of awakening and be empowered like that is a powerful thing,
Yep.
And, we get the clean water policies. We get, we get the focus that we demand as citizens. Right. And so it's, and even when it doesn't come out exactly the way you want it, or maybe you lose, it happens. Right. But it is empowering and rewarding to have participated in that process.
Yep.
it's always best to win.
Right.
but it's always best to win. But I mean, it's easy to be an armchair critic, right?
Right.
I mean, it's like the Monday morning quarterback thing, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Hindsight's 20. I mean, there's all kinds of ways you can put it, but to have participated, to have gotten on the field and fought the battle is where it's at. Like, we need to get people off the couch and get them involved.
I think that's a great way to put it, because like you said, you either you don't have any regrets if you voice your opinion and you make your voice heard, whether you win or lose. Of course you want to win, but you can't say that you didn't do everything within your, ability or you've done everything you could at that point. Is basically, if you're participating in cleanups, you're seeing the problem, you're voicing your opinion at a policy level that can affect policy in a positive way, and as a result of that, have a more resilient environment. Then you've won, in my opinion. But
yeah. And right. And let me tell you a story. I remember when we were working with down in Mount Pleasant on their single-use plastic ban. It was the night of the final vote, and the room had filled up, and the public comment period had started, and this woman who Cheryl and I recognized from our cleanups got up, and she kind of grabbed the mic and pulled it down a little bit, and says, she's like, "I do cleanups for Charleston Waterkeeper. I've seen this problem, and it's bad." And so, like that, and you should have seen, councils, backs get straight, they lean in to listen, and it, like that sort of firsthand experience, like that carries the day. That firsthand, I saw this problem. I'm a voter. I'm paying attention. I'm educated about this issue. I've taken action on this issue, and I'm here to tell you that you need to do this thing tonight. Like I mean, that is such a powerful message, message. And those are the successes. Those things don't always make the headlines. They don't, like, that piece doesn't make the headline. But those. I mean, they should make the headlines. That should have been the headline. But, that's just not the way the world works. But it's those little actions that people take that make the difference.
Yeah.
I guess we might, maybe just touch on that notion of resiliency and climate change and all that. And I think we've had just a great conversation, and we could fill up a whole nother probably half day talking about, some of the impacts that we see here locally with climate change and, in our waterways. It's striking too. You talk a lot to some of the old time fishing guides here in town, just how much things have changed, in their lifetimes, which, when you talk to some of these guys, they go back to the 90s, right? I mean, you talk to some really old timers, they might go back further, but it's just amazing to hear those stories firsthand. But, I think, especially, I think it was this Sunday, the Post and Courier wrote the piece about, tree canopies and how trees and all that can affect flooding, or the loss of trees can affect flooding. But, I think we need to be thinking about that connection between the land and the water a lot more, right? Yep. What we do on land impacts the quality and the health of our waterways. And I think, I think we don't think about that enough. And as a community, we don't think about that enough. And it's always struck me how, your waterway, your creek, your river, your harbor, your bay, your inland lake, or whatever it is, it's sort of the least common denominator in the community. It's the one thing that everybody, well, actually by law, right? By law has a right to, and it reflects our best and our worst all at the same time, right? It's where all the dirty pollution ends up, right? But it's also where you take your kid and they catch the first redfish, right? Or, they first nail it with the cast net or something, right? they hit that big pancake and the eyeball goes up. Like, all right. But, it reflects, our best and our worst all at the same time. And I think we've really got to come to grips with that as a community, to be able to leave the next generation something that's as special as what we inherited from the folks before us.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's, something we could, and I think this threat of, climate change and its impact here locally in our waterways and our marshes is, going to be the real defining challenge moving forward.
Well, I think, so part of, as you know, what I do with, merger strategies is help businesses to reduce their carbon footprint. And so that's part of it. That's mitigation, I guess, in terms of, but what you're talking about in terms of some of the natural climate solutions that are available, that's really at this point is, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's almost an adaptation strategy, because you're going, look, here's, we're seeing the sea level rise. I think the stat from Post and Courier was, in 2019, there was 89 days of flooding. So, I mean, you cannot be a resident of the Lowcountry, whether it's in Charleston or Savannah, and not have experienced coastal flooding and say that that's not happening. Because I grew up here, and in Savannah, and Tybee Road, the road out to Tybee Island, never flooded. And now that's starting to happen more frequently when they get a lot of rain and bigger tides, and same thing's happening here, but we're also seeing it where it's sunny day flooding. And so that, I guess it really makes the problem even worse when you consider what Charleston Waterkeeper is talking about with water quality issues.
Right.
You have a flood that's caused from sea level rise that puts bacteria out into the creeks where you recreate and where you fish and you surf. Those are, I guess, the best way I can summarize it, and the connection with land and water, is that this is all interconnected, and we've got to start paying closer attention to that. And
right. It's so true. It's so true. And I think a lot of times here locally, we talk about flooding and some of those climate impacts through the lens of property damage, economic damage, inconvenience, and all of those things are important and true. But the thing I think we don't talk about it enough is what it means for the health of our waterways, right? What it means for the health of the estuary. And that's what really scares me. Every time there's a flood event, that is a huge, huge pollution event for your harbor, right? All that dirty water that you see folks running through and swimming in and wakeboarding and all that sort of thing. It's not, it doesn't just magically go. It drains into the harbor. Right. And, we've got to get a handle on that. And again, there's two parts here. There's protecting what's left of the wetlands, the forested, the freshwater wetlands, the saltwater wetlands that are able to be protected. But it is also re-engineering our built environment to mimic that natural relationship between land and water, where rainwater can soak in over time and not just run off into the nearest creek or river. And that's the piece, right? It can't just be about seawalls and pumps, right? We're going to have to do some of that, right, in certain places. But, we're not looking at this issue regionally, right? The city of Charleston's pretty active on some of this, mostly through this idea of seawalls and pumps and stuff. But, we're not talking about a countywide, tri-county area. We're not even talking about it as a whole sort of coastal empire, right? The coastal plain of South Carolina ought to be united on some of these issues. Yeah. And we could go on and, keep adjusting the scale upward, but let's just start with our county, and then let's start with the 8 coastal counties in the state. The way we experience it here is very different from the way they experience climate change and some of these issues in Greenville or in Spartanburg or, in Oconee County, right? It's a lot more visceral here, in our area, because we're on the edge of the issue. We're on the front lines of it, right?
Yeah.
We are on the front lines, whether we like it or not, or whether we admit it or not, we are. And, the sooner we can, learn from nature and adapt, the more resilient we'll be and the more viable we'll be as a community.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe something that if you don't live in the Lowcountry, you may not be aware of, but like some of these sort of natural climate solutions that we're talking about. I mean, for example, our marshlands. I mean, they are vast salt marshes, but they're not just full of redfish on flood tides or fiddler crabs and blue crabs and provide a nursery. They also sequester large amounts of carbon. And so if these marshlands start to disappear, we're also just adding insult to injury. But also things like, hey, barrier islands, oyster beds that we talked about, oyster reefs. What are these things doing? Well, when we experience a hurricane, these barrier islands and marshlands and oysters are the first line of defense to protect us from storm surge. And that is not man-made engineering. That is nature saying, I know best. I know how to best protect the mainland. And here's sort of your first several lines of defense. And when we deteriorate that or weaken it, we wind up paying for it quite literally.
We put, it's funny. We put all this, all this man-made vulnerable built environment into a really dynamic system. And then are surprised when, we experience impacts from that. And, I think we need to look towards nature. It's not about pumps and seawalls. It's about oyster beds and salt marsh restoration, and providing corridors and pathways for that stuff to adapt to the changing conditions naturally. I think we do a lot better. And I think we do a lot better to look in that direction for solutions. I really do. And I think the sooner we get there, the better.
Yeah. I'll give this one mention. If anyone out there listening is looking to get inspired on climate action, check out Project Drawdown. It's a book. It's like 100 solutions to reverse global warming. I think they've got I can't remember what the website is. It might just be Drawdown. Anyway, I'm just throwing it out there if anyone's interested.
That's a good one, yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting book to look at because I think they kind of marry some of these natural climate solutions with, all right, well, what do we need to do they just look at it from all different angles to see how we can solve it today with existing solutions. And part of this, what we're talking about, these natural climate solutions is a big part of that.
Right. We're there's no shortage of experts. Right? We know what to do.
The solutions are here.
It's just, can we do it? Can we take the collective action necessary?
Yeah. All right. Well, Andrew, whether they're in Charleston or regionally here, they want to get involved or make a donation to Charleston Waterkeeper, where can they volunteer? Where can they find more information?
The easiest way for folks is to go to charlestonwaterkeeper.org, and you can do everything there. There's a handy little button if you're looking to support this kind of work financially or make a donation or a gift. There's a handy little button that says donate at the upper right-hand corner of the website. If you're looking to get involved with your time and your talents and your efforts, you can go to charlestonwaterkeeper.org/volunteer. And that'll bring up a list of events, and you can sign up for them all online. And that'll kind of log you in the system for a spot. And then you'll start to hear from Cheryl Carmack, who will get you all dialed in for the next or whichever opportunity you signed up for. But yeah, that's a great way. And hopefully in 2021, we'll be able to be out in the community a little bit more. So it's always fun to come out. Our local brewery community has been super supportive, and it's always fun to drink a beer and talk clean water and meet some other like-minded people. So we'll start doing some of those types of events again too, when it's a little safer for everybody to be together. And it all starts with just coming out to an event, showing up, You know, that's what we encourage people to do, you know, stand up, show up, and speak up for clean water.
That's awesome. Well, yeah, I'd just like to also, before we wrap here, would like to say thank you to Andrew and Cheryl for everything y'all do for our water here in Charleston. I've personally loved volunteering and getting involved on a policy level, but also I love that Charleston Waterkeeper, as Andrew said, is a conduit and is providing solutions to whether it's plastic pollution or climate change here in our community, and I'm grateful for that. So thank you.
Well, and thank you, Rick. Really appreciate the opportunity to do this. Always fun to chat. And, you know, big shout out for what you're doing too. I think, you know, that idea of marrying conservation and business, you know, together is a real path and a model for going forward. You know, business and conservation aren't at the opposite ends of the spectrum. I mean, I think we're starting to see this more and more. And so kudos for the good work that you're doing too.
Well, I appreciate it. Thanks for listening to the Sustainable Angler Podcast, and special thanks to Andrew Wunderley from Charleston Waterkeeper. The Sustainable Angler is available anywhere you listen to podcasts, and if you like what you're hearing, leave a rating and review. That helps us out a lot. Thanks, and have a great day.